It's my privilege to welcome one of the most eminent thinkers of our times here for the virtual edition of the Lahore Literary Festival. We have with us today Fareed Zakaria. Fareed Zakaria is a household name. He's the one who hosts CNN's flagship International Affairs program, GPS, which has a viewership well over 220 million households. And he also has a column in the Washington Post. Fareed has authored many books, including the bestseller, The Post-American World. And I'm also very pleased to have Dr. Maleeha Lodhi join us as a panelist. Dr. Maleeha Lodhi is one of Pakistan's most prominent diplomats and journalists. She's a pioneer in the field of journalism for bringing in women voices. Dr. Lodhi has been Pakistan's ambassador in the US, UK, and also has served as the permanent representative of Pakistan to the UN. With that, I'd like to welcome both of you. And I'd like to start with Fareed to talk about his new work, which is 10 Lessons for the Post-Pandemic World. We're living in strange times, Fareed. It's been, of course, harrowing for many. The income disparities are being sharpened. Access to health is uneven. Even in some countries like ours, there's been no sort of roadmap yet in terms of figuring out the vaccination program. We're moving away from the material economy towards a more digital economy. Work norms are changing. So with all this hurly-burly world that we're witnessing, where do you see the immediate post-pandemic world in terms of our lives, work patterns, and the functioning of the nation state?
Thank you so much. First of all, it's a real pleasure to be here. I wish I could be in Lahore physically. It is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. I really enjoyed the last time I was there many, many years ago. And in fact, your brother Fasi was very kind enough, and your father, to host me for a lovely dinner and take me around town. So I have very fond memories of Lahore, which are tied up with your family. You asked a huge question. So let me just sketch out a few ways in which I think things are moving. First, to just recognize that this may be the most significant global event of our lifetimes. You know, if you think about it, 9/11 was something that had a great impact on a place like Pakistan, a place like the United States. But it was actually a very limited number of countries that felt the sort of seismic repercussions of 9/11. If you were in Brazil, if you were in Japan, you know, there was a limited amount it had to do with you. If you were in South Africa. Global financial crisis similarly had an impact on a certain tranche of countries that were connected in this highly sophisticated Western financial system with derivatives and credit default swaps and such things. For example, I talked to people in India who felt it had very little impact on them. They, of course, felt the recession, but you know, Indian finance was not particularly tied into those kind of exotic financial products. By contrast, this pandemic has really in some way or the other affected the lives of almost every human being on the planet. You know, even just in terms of the work stoppage, the change in the nature of work, the shift to the digital economy. And it's going to be longer than people think, because you know, I think we are now beginning to understand that while the development of the vaccines in 9 months is a miracle and really has taken place with an astonishing success, the process of vaccination, you know, is a very different one, and that is going to be a much slower process of manufacture, delivery, and then ultimately vaccination. Science can produce the vaccine, but you need a public health administration to vaccinate people. You know, and there are two things to understand. These are different. Having the vaccine and actually vaccinating people, pushing needles into arms, is a much more complicated process. So we're going to be in this for a while. So it's not only the breadth of the experience, but the length of the experience that I think makes this unusual. The fundamental shift is what I describe in the book as acceleration. You know, Lenin said there are decades when nothing happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen. And you can feel that in the way in which we have moved into a digital economy at a much faster pace than anyone imagined. Online shopping has exploded. You know, online movie watching. You have a situation where Warner Brothers, the largest movie studio in America, has released all of its 2021 movies, is going to release all of its 2021 movies online at the same time, you know, as they might do theater premieres in some places where that's allowed. Amazon is taking market share every day from other companies. I was mentioning earlier, you know, book sales are up in America because thankfully not everyone is watching Netflix. A few hardy souls are reading books like you. But Amazon was 30% of the market before the pandemic. It's now 60 to 65% of the market. So all those trends are accelerating. Working from home is accelerating. And we will, out of the post-pandemic world, come back to some kind of hybrid reality. I think the big difference between this pandemic and the last great one, the great influenza of 1917, 18, 19, is that time, you know, it was followed by the Jazz Age. It was followed by the Roaring 20s, because everyone, the pent-up desire to return to normalcy was very great. In fact, Warren Harding, the man who won the election after the pandemic, campaigned on, his slogan was a return to normalcy, quote unquote. But this time around, unlike then, you have an alternative. You know, and that time around, if you wanted to get back to work, you had to go physically to the office. If you wanted to get entertained, you had to go physically to a movie theater. If you wanted to engage in any kind of business, you had to physically engage. Now we have this virtual alternative. So the result will be a hybrid, some combination. We are going to get back to physical contact because we are social animals. But there is an enormous ease and, you know, there are certain things that this new medium does that are superior to physical contact. You were telling me, for example, Indians and Pakistanis can meet in this digital space much more easily than they can in the physical space. And there are hundreds of examples of things like that. So I imagine a new hybrid world. I imagine one in which we have moved more greatly into the digital economy. And unfortunately, I imagine a much more unequal world, because let's never forget, particularly in a place like Pakistan, that when we talk about the digital economy, we are talking about a small digital elite, well-trained, connected, educated, that do work that you can generate income using the virtual economy, whereas there are a large number of people who are locked out of that right now. And that reality, unfortunately, has also been exacerbated, if not accelerated, by the pandemic.
Fareed, if you would like to shed light on the United States of America, we've seen that there's been a dysfunctionality. You know, you've got the world's best laboratories, sciences are flourishing, universities, and the big pharma companies. So with all that extraordinary labyrinth of infrastructure, how come the United States and the UK weren't able to address the pandemic in a timely and organized manner? And will we potentially see this dysfunctionality continue after the pandemic is over?
You know, many years ago, John Kenneth Galbraith, the great economist, had a wonderful line about America. He said, what you see in America is private affluence and public squalor. And I think that captures it very well, which is that America is two things at the same time. It is extraordinarily dynamic, innovative, you know, in the realm of the private sector, but its government has always been burdened by a kind of anti-status mentality that outside the Pentagon has always wanted to keep government limited, constrained, underfunded, demeaned. And that anti-status tradition was given enormous energy over the last 40 years by the Reagan-Thatcher revolution. You know, that was a period whose effects we are now living through. But remember, I mean, Ronald Reagan comes to power in 1981 in the middle of a recession. And he says in his inaugural address, government is not the solution, government is the problem. Thatcher came in saying much the same thing. So what we have gone through is 40 years of defunding, demeaning, disrespecting government. And those agencies are badly staffed, are poorly, in many cases at the top levels, they have brilliant people like Dr. Fauci. The problem is that you have not built the capacity to quickly and elaborately get, and speedily fulfill certain public functions, because people always look at that and they say, my God, there's so much waste in government. The nature of government, of course, is that you have to have some capacity for unusual events. I mean, the classic thing in America is you always find that when there's a snowstorm in most cities, they don't have enough snow removal equipment because, for the previous 4 years, they hadn't had big snowstorms, and the government says, why the hell are we wasting all this money on preparing for snowstorms when they don't happen that often? And then when one happens, you find yourself unable to cope. And that is the nature of government, that it steps in those emergencies. It steps in and it has to have some capacity to function. The places that did the best really were the East Asian countries, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, if you think of it as a separate unit. Even Vietnam, which is a relatively poor country, has done astonishingly well. And that's because they have built up capacity of governance. They have good bureaucracies, a lot of flexibility, smart technocrats occupying them, a strong tradition of non-corruption, which is very important in the context of South Asia. Because all those things do, in particular, the sense that these are clean governmental systems, and particularly these technical public health bureaucracies, is that they create trust in the people, so that there is a very strong bond between government and people, in the sense that if the government tells you to do something, you think you agree and obey, you view it as a collective enterprise. Whereas I suspect in South Asia, when the government tells you to do something, your immediate instinct is, this is wrong. They're cheating us. There must be some way around this. Who do I have to bribe, or who do I have to call up to find my way, find my way around this? That difference, where the East Asians really performed extraordinarily well. I mean, Taiwan is a place of 22 million people, about the same size as Texas or New York State. It has 10 COVID deaths. Actually, it has under 10, I think it has 9. New York State is up to 40,000, I think, with actually smaller population size. So you get a sense of the extraordinary overperformance of these East Asian countries.
Fareed, would that be attributable to the certain character of a nation state? For instance, Denmark is a model that you've cited in your book. That's a far more homogeneous society than a heterogeneous society like the United States of America, with a population around 330 million people. So how do you apply standardization? How do you tax more people? If you tax more people, wouldn't there be yet more populism? Because when you are taxing people, there's got to be redistribution. And with the migration flows that are happening in a country like the United States, that could potentially provoke yet more provincialism and reinforcement of borders. So how do we really tackle the mantra of good governance across various disparate systems across the world?
So you ask a very good question. And there is clearly a tension between the idea of a generous welfare state and the idea of immigration and an immigrant society. Because in general, the countries in Europe have been able to create generous welfare states because people look at the people getting welfare and they can identify with them. I hate to put it this way, but they look at those people and they say, these people are just like me. They're just in straitened circumstances. And that just like me is a very visceral, emotional connection, which has something to do with race, religion, and ethnicity. And when you suddenly have people who look nothing like you, who are very, disparate, there is a tension. But The reason I think I would fundamentally differ with the analysis you put forward is this. Most European countries now have as many immigrants as a percentage of their population as does the United States. You know, one of the quiet revolutions that has taken place in Europe over the last 25 years is that Europe has become an immigrant society as well. The number of foreign-born in America, for example, is 15%. The number of foreign-born in Sweden is 20%. The number of foreign-born in Canada is 20%. So many of these countries have found a way to bring these people in. Now, I don't want to pretend there are tensions. Back to my original point. There's no question this is the challenge of particularly for Europe, integrating these people, finding a way to make them more American. The American system does it much better. Americans are much more socially integrated because there is no original population, as it were. You know, everyone has always come from somewhere. But I do think that you see that it's possible to integrate people. It is possible to find ways. And part of the answer is you can't use the old-fashioned welfare system. The reason I like Denmark is it's actually very modern in that while it's generous, there is a strong push to get people to work. So, you know, you do get unemployment insurance. It is generous, but it's tied to job retraining. You have to constantly be looking for work. They're constantly trying to find new jobs for you. The whole economy is very open to trade. So it's very competitive. People, you know, there are no restraints on firing people. Companies can hire and fire very easily. The unions have actually worked together with government to make that possible. So it's not the old-fashioned system that one thinks of. It's a kind of pro-work, pro-competitiveness, market-friendly system that, however, invests a lot. And most of the expenditures are on making sure that people have equality of opportunity, very high-quality childcare, very high-quality education at the lowest levels, very high-quality job retraining programs. So you spend a lot of money, in a sense, arming people, and then you send them out into the global economy and say, you know, sink or swim. Mm-hmm. That's more of a model that I think is applicable. And remember, people say Denmark is a small country. First of all, it is, but Germany is a big country, and they have a very similar profile. Canada is a big country. They have a very similar profile. So this is possible on a large scale as well.
I'd like to request Dr. Lodhi to join us for this conversation. And I'd like to talk to you about the idea of a new social contract. So Fareed quotes an editorial from FT, which is the bastion of new liberal economics, where a call for a new social contract is made. Dr. Lodhi, if you can opine on that and see how these trends are playing out in the global realm.
First of all, I think I will use what Fareed has just said as a springboard to explore further the question of why certain countries have managed the pandemic better. And that will partially also begin to address what you have asked, Razi, and why others haven't. So, you know, this is, again, it's shown a spotlight on the whole notion of governance and what does it take to govern well. And I think my conclusion from observing what's happened in the world is that it is not the type of political system that has enabled some states to manage the pandemic well, but it is a competent and effective state, something that Fareed also focuses on. In fact, I find fascinating the discussion in his book on governance and why the US faltered. And so, you know, I think if we cite the case of the Southeast Asian countries, those are not liberal democracies, in the classic sense of the word. But what they do have are the 2 or 3 crucial elements. One, as Fareed himself underlined, a competent state. 2, trust in government. And 3, I think a degree of national resilience. The notion that if you trust a government, then you will comply with what health authorities are saying. And yet we saw these scenes in the United States of people sort of throwing their masks. We saw the former president saying, I don't want to wear a mask. So, leadership also counts hugely, I think. And I think, the idea that trust has been, not the idea, but the conclusion by many opinion polls in recent decades, that trust has been eroding in governments, particularly in the West, but not just in the West, I mean, globally. And I think that is something that we need to also look at, because if there's one thing that's going to be important, as Fareed says, we're going to be, living with this for much longer than we would like. But the other aspect of this is going to be, of course, economic recovery. I mean, if countries do not effect an economic recovery after this prolonged period of the coronavirus crisis, then we see multiple crises ahead of us. So I think 2 or 3 things that we need to keep in focus. I will also say, and I know, Razi, you will get to it later, what has been striking at the global level. Of course, governance, we've seen some countries doing better, some countries not doing so well. But at the international level, global governance has totally failed, sadly. Again, it's not new. To borrow Fareed's term, all we've seen is an acceleration of a trend that was already there. But the lack of solidarity at the international front, and now we see it being expressed in what is called vaccine nationalism. The fights that are taking place between the EU, for example, and the United Kingdom over vaccines. And I think, some of these global trends are going to be, in a way, we're going to be confronted with overlapping crises in the days to come, or the months or the years to come. And yet we see 3 things: lack of international solidarity, global economic recovery that is contingent to a very large extent on something that I'm sure we will come to later, which is the relationship between China and the United States. And thirdly, I think the lack of global leadership. That's been stunning, actually. There has been no global leadership, not because we didn't see this before. Again, the pandemic has simply exposed previous fault lines and existing dysfunctionalities, both at the international level, regional level, as well as at national levels. So I think these are some very, very important areas which seem to suggest that we are in for multiple crises, overlapping crises, perhaps interconnected crises. And yet, you talked about the nation state. And yet, the need for international solidarity has not been, it hasn't been as great as it is now. I mean, it is intense. And
we'll get to those points. Fareed, I wanted to loop you in and ask you about the earlier narrative that you had framed in terms of the pace of the market. I mean, we've had the credit default swap in the form of the 2008 financial crisis. And now the pandemic has exposed yet more vulnerabilities of the market. So where are we going to go post-pandemic? Will we be seeking some sort of a more socialist orientation where the market is very much part and parcel of the market of ideas, but then we bring in social nets and welfareisms, which you see in parts of Europe? So I think that is, of course, on many people's minds. I mean, where does the market go from here, and how do you curb the desire for greed?
So I think, again, this is a case where, we are accelerating trends that were happening anyway. And as you say, much of this began with the crash of 08, 09, where people saw the entire global economy as much more unstable than they had previously. In fact, it had been unstable for a while. The global financial crash came on the heels of, if you remember going back, the Latin American debt crisis, the East Asian crisis, the Russian default, the tech bubble bursting, the housing market collapsing. So we built a very fast-moving, dynamic, innovative global economy, but it also is one highly prone to crashes. But what is happening now is it is all coming together, because what is clearly the trend line is going to be that governments are going to get much more involved in doing something very simple, which is providing cash to people. And it's going to be one of the great experiments around the world. And if it works, by which I mean to say, if it does not produce huge amounts of hyperinflation or currency collapses and things like that, and if it has the effect of stabilizing the economy, a lot of people are going to ask themselves, why shouldn't we do this more often and in other ways? In other words, this is something that, as you know, the Nobel Prize winning economists of last year, Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, have been arguing that it sounds like a very simple idea, but the idea is that the way to get rid of poverty is to give poor people money. It does not disincentivize them to work. It does not get wasted. It goes back into the economy. It's spent immediately and boosts demand. So if we move more in that direction, one could describe it as socialist, but I would resist that, because I would say what we're coming to understand is a kind of that government is inevitably involved, and the government cushions and rewards and punishes all kinds of economic behavior. What we are searching for is a way to do it so that it helps the little guy, so that it helps poor people, it raises their standards of living, and it economically benefits the whole nation. And certainly in advanced industrial countries, what is, if you look at the United States, there are vast government guarantees and government expenditures for middle-class people, for various sectors of the economy. If you look at the amount of money the United States government spends to stabilize, bolster, and reward agriculture, the real estate industry, through the deductions on home mortgages and things like that. These are huge expenditures. If you look at India, the huge subsidies that are made to agriculture. I don't know enough about the situation in Pakistan, but I bet you if you were to look through the budget, you would see that the government is spending lots of money. So this might be an argument to say there's a much more efficient way to do this. It helps poor people directly. And because we've had this experiment, you see it now. Ideally, again, this gets us back to the issue of can you organize government efficiently and competently? Ideally, you would get rid of a lot of those wasteful subsidies, counterproductive ones that are merely benefiting small handfuls of special interests, and provide more of these general ones that raise economic opportunity, lift people out of poverty. I don't know if that'll happen, but I think we're beginning to see that markets are not enough. That's one of my lessons. That the market by itself is producing a great deal of instability. It's producing a great deal of monopoly. Look at the technology space, where what the market has done is has provided you with companies with almost 90% market share, which is obviously bad for competition. It's a circumstance where the consumer has very little capacity to fight back, as it were. So there are all these tendencies within particularly advanced industrial economies in the digital space that the market will not solve that problem. The market has found a very efficient solution. We should all buy everything on Amazon. But the question is that a good, viable social model? What does that do to the hundreds and thousands of small dukandars out there? What does it do to all the little mom and pop shops? What does it do to a town which now no longer has a thriving retail business, which is the classic kind of small business that people would go into without a lot of training, college education, etc. Those are the kind of questions that the market can't answer. Only politics can answer. Only people can answer through social and political movements.
So for all this that you've identified in terms of the trends, do we require a international order through strong institutions like the World Health Organization, including the European Union, to aid and abet the losers in the overall equation? I mean, you mentioned in your book a wonderful example of EU where it came to the rescue, the rich countries in EU, France and Germany came to the rescue of the poorer ones through the floating of bonds. And there's also another wonderful example of the eradication of smallpox during the Cold War, which brought Soviet Union and under Khrushchev, brought Soviet Union and the US together. So I'm just curious to know, how can we further facilitate the growth of international institutions? They've of course taken a huge battering because of the rise of nativism and populism in democratic as well as the emerging countries. So how do we sort of define the way forward for more solidified world order, which is sort of decorated with all these institutions that are effective as well?
So a large part of this will have to happen at the level of the nation state. You're not going to be able to find, we're just not in that world where we will transcend the nation state. And that's properly so. People feel a responsibility and an identification with what happens in their own country. Obama gave a speech once, I think it was during the signing of the South Korean American free trade deal. And he said, look, we all know what the right answer is here. Trade expands it expands the economic pie, it creates more economic activity, it produces more jobs, but it does produce winners and losers. And every time we sign one of these trade deals, we say that we're going to help compensate the losers, and we never do. And that over time is going to produce more and more distrust of the whole free trading system. And that is essentially what has happened. It's that for the last 40 years, we have not compensated the losers enough. And as a result, they look at the trade, this process of expansion of trade, expansion of opportunities as a win-lose, not a win-win. Some people win, but some people lose, and the losers are essentially angry. That is what Trump is about. That's what Brexit is about. That's what the Gilets jaunes movement in France is about. So I think that some large measure of this is going to have to happen domestically. But what you point to, and Dr. Lodhi was talking about very eloquently, is the collapse of international kind of camaraderie, comity, cooperation, execution. And this is, I think, very sad, because the pandemic is by nature global. The only solution to it is going to be global. We are literally not going to be safe unless everybody is vaccinated. Otherwise, what's going to happen is you're going to have an island of stability but outside of that island, there are going to be these new strains of the virus that will keep popping up. And that island won't be that stable anymore, because as we saw with the original virus, we're so interconnected that somebody somewhere is going to travel somehow, and you're going to end up with the new variants, perhaps more potent ones, coming and infecting people in the supposedly secure islands of stability anyway. So we need greater international cooperation. This is an area where I'm still hopeful, because so much of this kind of international cooperation has typically been organized by the United States. Trump was a marked departure from that, but he was a great exception. If you think back to Ebola and under Obama, to the AIDS crisis under George Bush, U.S. provided huge amounts of leadership, and it doesn't get enough credit often, but these have been extraordinary, largely selfless endeavors. But I think the Biden people might get back to that world, and they might, they're only a few weeks in office, so I don't fault them for not doing this, but I know that the people there want a return to the kind of American leadership. Now, part of it is it must be leadership exercised in a new way, in a much more cooperative, less unilateral, less arrogant way, and in a way that shares the burden. I mean, if ideally the United States, the European Union, and China should come together and say, we are going to organize a grand plan to vaccinate the world, and we will pay for it all. Frankly, it wouldn't cost much money, because most of the rich countries have overpaid for vaccines. Canada has 5 times as many vaccines as it needs on order. At some point when they get them, they haven't gotten them yet, they have to do something. They have said they're going to donate the excess to vaccinate third world countries. If every rich country were to do that, we already have 60% of, we have enough vaccines to vaccinate 60% of the world. So you only need to get to about 80% of the world. So there's a way to do this. It's not even that expensive anymore, because these funds have already been committed. It just needs leadership, vision, organization.
Dr. Lodhi, if you can comment on the emerging rivalry between China and the United States of America. In light of that, we've seen wars in the seas as well as non-tariff barriers. How do we really strengthen the international order? I mean, there are many exceptions from the Cold War era, but will we be able to institutionalize practices that enable this kind of facilitation in critical arenas like vaccinations?
the paradox of our present era is that we see growing multipolarity, but we've seen in recent decades an undermining of multilateralism. One would have thought that with greater multipolarity, you would have obviously a greater need for international cooperation and solidarity, but we have not seen that happen. Now, there are many reasons for that. I think the Trumpian policy of unilateralism had much to do with the erosion of a rules-based international order, the fact that the US pulled out of so many international treaties, international organizations, but he wasn't the only one. We saw regional strongmen who took unilateral actions, whether they were Putin in Crimea, or it was Prime Minister Modi in occupied Jammu and Kashmir. And there are many examples to show that it seemed that people were beginning to act much more unilaterally and defying international law and international norms. So that really shook the multilateral system. Of course, one can argue, and I would agree with that argument, that the multilateral system itself is in need of reform because it has to reflect a much more multipolar world. Let's not forget the United Nations, where I served for many years, is really a product of the Second World War and the powers that were at that time, the victors of the Second World War. That was reflected in the structure of the United Nations. So the UN has to change too. The Security Council has to be reformed. All of this has to change because I think what we've also been seeing, we look at the top, which is the leadership level, government level, but publics across the world have also been skeptical. And in a way, their faith has been eroding in multilateral institutions. So there is a need to renew that. And I would agree with Fareed that the Biden administration offers an opportunity, I think, for multilateralism to be renewed. And I agree that it'll have to be a very different kind of leadership because this is no unipolar moment anymore. That ended 2 decades ago. So the United States needs to learn how to share power in international organizations, to listen to others. And I agree, it has to act with greater humility. Now, turning to the most consequential relationship of our era, the relationship between China and the United States. I think we, certainly in Pakistan, our hope is that we see greater collaboration between the two because that is in the interest of global economic recovery, because that is contingent and dependent really not on trade sanctions and on trade tariffs and on protectionism, the kind of policies that were associated with Trump, but it is predicated, this kind of cooperation, and again, a sharing. One of the things that Fareed looks at in his book in a lot of detail, and it's a fascinating part of his book, is the digital world. But we see that this confrontation between the United States and China, or let's say the tensions between them, has also produced a fragmentation of the digital world and the supply lines of the digital world into two. It's been rendered asunder. So on the one hand, you have US-led tech companies doing whatever they're doing. And on the other hand, you have the Chinese. So, this kind of fragmentation, it has to be somehow addressed, resolved. So I think the relationship between the two, as I said, President Biden has a huge opportunity, as I said, to renew multilateralism, to go back to the kind of international organizations that the US played such a key role in, but also to understand that it can no longer be the dominant power in these international organizations. As I said, it has to learn to share power. And with China, to arrive at a rapprochement, which is in the interest of both countries, but also in the interest of the world, because so much depends on whether they have a smooth relationship or whether they have a rocky relationship. So much in our region depends on that, and so much in the world depends on that.
Fareed, do you see some sort of a new deal emerging from the new administration in DC? Will there be sort of a Roosevelt-like push towards Keynesian economics to provide the necessary fillip to diminish the disparities that are growing in the States?
Yeah, I think that there's no question domestically that Biden is going to be very ambitious and that he's going to probably get most of what he wants through Congress. I think that one very important issue here has been the lesson of 08-09, when the Obama administration believed that they ended up going too small. They listened to the Republicans, they worried too much about the debt and deficit, and they ended up with a much slower recovery than they could have achieved. I think Biden doesn't want to make the same mistake. I think there's much greater consensus around that. And also, the fears of the deficit hawks never materialized. I mean, frankly, they haven't materialized for 20 years. I think we are in a very unusual period where, because, in a sense, the globalization and the information revolution have caused, have produced they're like global deflation machines, pushing down on prices everywhere. Think about, if you are particularly if you're somebody who makes auto parts in Michigan, let's say, everything you do can be done in some sense by a machine, increasingly, or by somebody in India, China, Pakistan, Bangladesh for much cheaper. So those two forces, the mechanization and through software particularly, and the globalization, have the effect of a downward pressure on prices, particularly of people who work with their hands, which is the dominant, which is still the vast majority of people in the world. So the result of that is the most worrisome form of inflation is wage inflation, but labor has no pricing power left. And so you have a very, very peculiar circumstance where, if you look at the Federal Reserve's expectations of inflation, I know this is a wonky point, but it's very important. The expectations of inflation over the last 20 years, every year, they have overestimated the amount of inflation. What that tells you is there's some kind of downward trend on inflation, which means that worries that the debt and deficit will blow up inflation seem to be overdone, but in the advanced industrial world. Think in places like Pakistan and India, it's a little different, but in the advanced industrialized world. So I think you'll see Biden go big on that. Where I don't know that you will see the Rooseveltian, the FDR approach is in international affairs, because what Dr. Lodhi was saying is very important, which is the question of whether there will be cooperation between the US and China. I think there is a much stronger mood in the United States of a desire to compete with China and compete along every dimension. Now, my fear is this. I think there is an element of very healthy competition, where if the United States also engages in, investments in its science and technology, investments in its infrastructure, investments in job retraining so that people become more skilled and can compete better. Those are all fantastic things in competing with China. Build out a great 5G infrastructure, build out a great solar green technology infrastructure. If, on the other hand, the competition ends up being around tariffs, barriers, military competition, arms races, space arms races, cyber attacks and such, that is a highly destabilizing prospect for the world. So the question is, which zone of competition will we go into? And my fear is, it's much easier to do all that stuff on the international stuff. Domestic renewal is hard work. It's laborious. It means taking on special interests at home. It's much easier to have a kind of international competition. And it will place every country like Pakistan is right in the crosshairs of this competition. It would have to choose what kind of technology ecosystem it wants to live in, what kind of 5G ecosystem it wants to live in. But the one point I would make, and I'd love to hear Dr. Lodhi's response, we often spend a lot of time in these kind of discussions talking about the United States because it has been the dominant power and organizer in chief. But a lot of this is happening because of China. Xi Jinping's China is a very different China than the previous 25 years. It is more repressive at home. The state has taken on a much larger role in the economy. Just look at the way in which they handled the Ant IPO and the disappearance of Jack Ma, the richest man in China. I mean, imagine if that were to happen in Pakistan or in India, that suddenly the richest businessman in the country literally disappears for 2 months. And internationally, look at what China is doing with Australia, with Vietnam, with the Philippines, with Japan, with Taiwan, with India. In every case, there has been a marked ramp up in China's assertiveness, in China's aggressive behavior. So much so with the Australians, the Chinese have issued a 14-point demand, which includes that Chinese think tanks should not produce research that the Chinese government, Australian think tanks should not produce research that the Chinese government believes is offensive. This is a new China. And, one of the questions that I think we're going to have to deal with is how does one accommodate a new China that seems much more expansionist? And should one accommodate a China that seems much more expansionist, or should there be an element of deterrence in this relationship?
Dr. Lodhi, would you like to elaborate on that and see it from the standpoint of where we are in terms of Pakistan and South Asia? I think, I'll come to Pakistan and South Asia in a minute, but to respond to what Fareed has posed, I think he's right, but I would disagree, with some of his assertions. He's right that we do see a new China. Of course, we'll see a new China. This is a self-confident China. This is a more assertive China. This is a China which wants to now be acknowledged as not just a rising power, but a power that has risen. And above all, it wants to be respected and not ridiculed, as well as the kind of invective that was thrown at China by the Trumpian administration. So I think some of it is a reaction to that. So we need to understand that. The second is, I think, one thing that Fareed perhaps didn't mention is the role that the Belt and Road Initiative is playing. This is the biggest economic initiative of our century globally. And more than 65 countries have signed up to this. Now, they haven't signed up because China is expansionist. They've signed up because they have something to gain from a huge economic investment, development enterprise. So this is going to also be a very important and a defining part of the Chinese policy, and Pakistan is the pivot of Belt and Road by our CPEC, as we call it, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. So I think, yes, you are seeing a more assertive China, but you're also, and yes, I think we see a new or a renewal of nationalism in China, because I think there is this sense under President Xi that we're not going to now just take the kind of Western, not just criticism, but Western attacks on us, lying down. So we need to respond. So President Xi, to some extent, is responding to that kind of public opinion in his country. But at the same time, and I'll conclude with this, China still insists, and I think it has much to show for it, that on its peaceful rise. It has more to gain with upholding the existing rules of the international game than in rewriting them or changing them. It may well come down to that later. But at the moment, I think it is very clear. And I would also say that, look at their response to want to work with the new administration in the United States. I think they have everything to gain by a cooperative United States. Competitive, yes, absolutely. And I think we're going to see a lot of tech wars, as Fareed was also mentioning. And there'll be wars in many areas. But I think it's in the interest of global stability and global peace that these two superpowers, these two economic powers, cooperate with each other, compete, but also in a cooperative way and not in a confrontational way. Because I think the downside and the destabilizing effects of a prolonged confrontation between the two countries is not just bad for those two countries. I don't think it's in the interests of the world, and certainly not in the interests of South Asia. Well, in the face of this growing rivalry and the confrontation between these two powers, do you think that there's really, in fact, a sustainable framework for developing the institutions that could avoid the circumstances that led to the grievous turn of events after the First World War? Fareed?
Well, I think, you raised the central tension here, which is how to build an open rules-based international system, or how to maintain and strengthen an open rules-based international system within which there's going to be significant great power competition. So, after the First World War, the fundamental reason it didn't work was because the largest power in the world, the United States, essentially abnegated and decided it didn't want to participate. The rising powers that were trying to rewrite the rules essentially wanted to destroy that system, Germany and Japan, and to a certain extent, Italy. Franklin Roosevelt's great lesson from that was that America has to be engaged and at the center on any such international system. And he created that system. It got paralyzed by the Cold War because the Soviet Union and the United States ended up kind of creating two blocks. And so the UN was permanently deadlocked until 1990. So what we have is, this is a new experiment where we have an international system that is reasonably open and rule-based. And yet we are seeing the rise of growing competition between the United States and China. I agree with Dr. Lodhi that ideally we find a way to demarcate zones of cooperation, zones of competition. We find ways to compete within this larger system. And it's a win-win for the United States and China. Look, at the end of the day, you will have a larger, global economic pie. You'll have more openness, more dynamism. But I do have to say, because whenever we have these conversations, there is a tendency to always focus on America's failings because it's an open country, and I welcome that. I think that's part of being a democracy. But the beginning of the tech bifurcation did not happen in the United States. It was China that essentially banned every large American tech company from participating in the Chinese economy. It is the only major economy in the world where American tech companies cannot participate is China. It's Google, Facebook, Amazon, or what have you. And that was a Chinese decision entirely because they want to maintain political control over information. Similarly, when you talk about Xi Jinping, I think it's important to remember Xi Jinping came to power many years before Donald Trump. The things I've been talking about predate Donald Trump. So, and I'm not absolving the United States of blame at all, but I'm saying there's a dynamic going on here where each side's hardliners are reinforcing the others. And we have to find a way to diffuse those tendencies and find some way to create a kind of collaborative spiral rather than a competitive spiral. But and maybe a country like Pakistan actually can play a healthy role because it has relationships with each of these countries. Maybe the Europeans could play a healthy role because they also do not want to see themselves caught in the middle of one of these new Cold Wars. But I think that without significant statesmanship on both sides, I think there is certainly a danger that you end up with a competitive spiral. And in that circumstance, to answer your fundamental question, I don't think a rules-based liberal international order can survive if there is a very intense rivalry, competition, geostrategic competition between the two largest players in the game. I think you will have a bifurcated global economy. You will have a bifurcated global technology system. You will have bifurcated military alliances. And by the way, this is not a circumstance that is really great for China. The United States has 59 treaty alliances in the world. China has one with North Korea. The big difference between the United States and China is the United States has grown to great power in almost in a vacuum, in two vast oceans, two weak neighbors. So it has been able to sustain itself without triggering great geopolitical anxiety. China is rising in a very different geostrategic environment. It is surrounded by neighbors. It has had border disputes with 16 of its neighbors. It has resolved most of them. But that tells you that as China rises, it causes enormous anxiety in Japan, in South Korea, in Vietnam, in the Philippines, in India, in Australia. And so it needs to be somewhat, that's why Deng Xiaoping's slogan to the Chinese, hide your light under a bushel, rise economically, but don't flex your muscles so much politically, militarily, was actually very wise advice. And it was not just about China when it was a small country. It was about recognizing the unusual, almost unique circumstances of China's rise in a crowded continent surrounded by other medium-sized powers.
So with these kind of security dilemmas that you're talking about, that China and the United States will face, will there be different spheres of influence, and as a result, different notions of what constitutes as the truth? Because at the heart of the pandemic is the crisis of science. Science was devalued. Even the World Health Organization last year wasn't able to ring off the alarm bells in time. So I was just wondering, with these different spheres of influence, there'd be different notions of truth. Would science be contested yet again? And how do we sort of avert that possibility? Because World Health Organization has to be strengthened in order to navigate the way forward for a coherent approach to managing future pandemics.
Yeah, I mean, you're raising a very good question. In some ways, there are two separate issues you raise. One is that this whole issue of experts and expert knowledge has gotten tied up in what is essentially a new class warfare between a kind of urban educated elite who are now benefiting from the pandemic because their skills can be translated in the digital economy very easily, and a less educated, more rural working class that resents this power and influence that the urban elite have. And if you think about it, the resentment of the rural, uneducated class is at the heart of the Trump phenomenon, of Brexit, of the Gilets jaunes in France, but it is also part of the support for Erdogan in Turkey, for Modi in India. There is a certain, for Duterte in the Philippines, there is a certain resentment of this, know-it-all knowledge class that lives in cities and is quite removed from the experience of their countrymen in large parts of their countries. There's an even broader issue, which is that we are entering a kind of post-truth world because of the rise of social media, digital manipulation, deep fakes on video, and the ability to kind of contest truth in that way. This is kind of, for those who have studied literary criticism, we're in a kind of Derrida-like world where everything is subjective. There is no objective truth. Everything is in the eye of the beholder. I think it's a frightening, reality, because it's fundamentally a kind of post-enlightenment, post-truth era where anyone can claim anything, and you have some kind of quote-unquote legitimate basis on which you can build it and present it and articulate it. And I have no answer to that second problem. I think it is a deep problem. It's very worrying. It gets at if you look at global per capita GDP, it is basically a flat line until you get to the late Enlightenment, essentially the scientific revolutions, which then produced the Industrial Revolution. And that's when human beings start to move out of poverty across the world, first in the West, then in the rest. What we are doing is really attacking the fundamental basis of that scientific revolution, the idea that there is truth. There are objective facts that can be determined through trial and error, through posing of hypotheses and testing those hypotheses against facts, and therefore accumulating knowledge that can help move us out in sphere after sphere, from science to social sciences to other disciplines. And if we believe that is not actually the way forward, I think we're in a very difficult moment for humanity, not just any one country.
Fareed, on that, I'd love to inquire from you, what role does the human agency have against all these structural forces that we delineated during this conversation? And you can perhaps also bring in the Lawrence of Arabia passage that you've brought in the book at the end.
So I end the book with this wonderful scene from Lawrence of Arabia, which is one of the great, great movies of all time. Great David Lean movie with Peter O'Toole playing Lawrence and Omar Sharif playing Sharif Ali, the leader of the Arabs. So to remind people, the basic story is Lawrence of Arabia is trying to organize the Arabs to declare independence from the basically to attack the Ottoman Empire and to declare their independence from the Ottomans, who are allied with Germany in World War I. So he's trying to get a band of Arabs to attack the Ottoman port of Aqaba, and they're launching this huge military campaign through the desert. And as they're moving along very fast, one of the Bedouin warriors they realize has been left behind, and Lawrence says, "I'll go back and get him." And the tribesmen, the other warriors, say, "No, he's forget about him. His time has come. This is it is written." And this is kind of embodying the fatalism of the East, as it were. And Lawrence refuses, turns back, and through a swirling sandstorm finds the man, brings him back, and presents him triumphantly to Sharif Ali, the Omar Sharif, the leader of the Bedouins. And he says, and he looks at him and he says, "Nothing is written," meaning, human beings write their own destiny. They write their future. And I think it's really very true of the moment we're in, because you have a huge disruptive force, the pandemic, that has unsettled things. So it provides an opportunity, as all such crises do. We never change in good times. We only change when things have already been unsettled, when there are crises, when you already have gotten accustomed to the idea of some degree of disruption. So so the pandemic has opened up the world, as it were, to us. And which direction we go is up to us. In the 1920s, after World War I, the world was opened up and there were directions we could go in, and many leaders chose bad directions. In 1945, after World War II, the world opened up again, and large parts of the world chose very wisely and chose to go in a good direction. So similarly, we have an opportunity. We can try to forge greater international cooperation around this pandemic, vaccinate the world, find ways to build on that cooperation. We can, on the other hand, turn inwards and become more narrowly nationalistic. It really is up to us, and it's up to each one of us, because each of us in some sense has a role to play in terms of choosing leaders, expressing our preferences, giving voice to concerns, to really kind of help nudge forward the kind of forces and values that we think the world should embody. Because if we don't do it, we might find ourselves 5 or 7 years, 10 years, 15 years down the line, living in a much more nasty world than we wanted to. People, nobody after World War I wanted a world that ended up with the rise of fascism and the destruction of the international system and another world war. They just made bad choices or through sins of omission allowed these forces to gather that ended up destroying the world.
Dr. Lodhi, I'd like to inquire from you, how could we further bolster cooperation between the United States under the new administration and Pakistan? It's a time when, of course, we've seen many ebbs and flows this past decade, but given the opportunity that this pandemic also opens up for more global cooperation, how can we further foster the bilateral relations between America and Pakistan?
Well, I think for a start, what we've been previously discussing is going to have a huge impact on where Pakistan-US relations are going to go, which is the big picture, big issue, the big geopolitical issue of our times, the relationship between China and the United States. Because Pakistan has already made its strategic choice. Its strategic choice is China. So therefore, it will not be party or line up with any kind of US directed containment of China policy. And I am confident that under President Biden, I think there'll be a much more mature response to China. The competition will be, rough and rocky, but that doesn't mean that they have to see China as an adversary, as a competitor, yes, as an adversary, no. So I think that big picture impact will be there. The other key issue, of course, the bilateral relationship, we've had a roller coaster relationship. It's been, up and down, and it's been a function of a huge geopolitical event, usually in our region. So, what Pakistan seeks is a relationship which is much more stable, which is actually intrinsic to the two countries rather than contingent upon a third country or an event that has taken place. But I do think that the Biden administration's approach, and it's now doing a review of its Afghan policy, that also will determine where the relationship is going to go. Because in the near term, Pakistan's cooperation for bringing peace and stability back, for the peace process that is stalled right now, awaits the review undertaken by the Biden administration. So if the US continues to support the Doha Agreement between the Taliban and the United States itself, and the peace process that has made modest progress, but obviously has a long way to go, then I think we can look at a very strong basis for cooperation between the two countries, which would help, I think, to steady the kind of erratic relationship that we had under President Trump. So certainly President Biden is no stranger to Pakistan. He visited, he visited was as vice president-elect, and he knows many Pakistani leaders. So that familiarity is also a point of advantage for Pakistan. Here's somebody you don't have to brief a great deal. He knows the issues and the dynamics of this region. So I think my own sort of advice to our policymakers is be imaginative, be swift, and be reasonable in the sense that our expectations should match also the kind of relationship that we have with China. So in other words, there will be limits to what we can expect of the United States, given its competition with China and the fact that Pakistan's relationship with China will continue to be a strategic one and an extremely close one. So I think, again, the challenges are there, but so is the opportunity. And, internationally also, just let me say a quick few words. Internationally also, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that the need for countries to see the gains that they can make by cooperating, rather than being at odds with each other. So the post-pandemic period can perhaps provide a departure from the past, where countries tended to just focus on themselves rather than look beyond. Because I think for everyone, the global economic recovery is going to be the key to whether they can recover themselves economically, nationally. So that's going to drive a great deal of how countries will respond and react to international cooperation.
Fareed, any concluding remarks?
No, I think Dr. Lodhi put it very well. I think that one of the things we haven't talked about, which I frankly don't talk enough about in the book, is finally, we spend a lot of time talking about how we react to these kind of events through external measures. What kind of plans and programs and policies and governmental supports do we need? But this is also an opportunity to think about what internal supports do we need to get through these kind of periods. What has it taught us about who we are as people? What are the internal resources we need? What are the values? What are the priorities that the pandemic has revealed for each one of us? And I think in that sense, it's also been an opportunity to think through what's important in your life. What are the ways that you handle the self-imposed isolation or the break with certain kinds of patterns of behavior, travel and things like that you would do. So in a way, it helps you. These things are sometimes great revealers. And if you view it that way, it can also provide you with an opportunity to change internally, not just externally.
Well, we hope that the Lahore Literary Festival becomes that revealer, because we've really brought in a panoply of voices from across the world, and we're celebrating the arts and letters. So with that, thank you very much, Fareed. Thank you, Dr. Lodhi. It's been a delight talking to both of you. And I'm sure there were many interesting, revealing accounts that the audience will also find through this dialogue. Thank you.